my name is Megan. I'm the curator of exhibitions here at the Art and Culture Center, and we have two really incredible shows that are on view right now through February 27th. The main exhibition is Introspective, A Reckoning of the Soul, that is curated by Marie Bickles and myself, and Marie is here with us today. Happy to see you. And then we are actually sitting in the room with a component of this exhibition, a solo project by Shire Regans, aka Vanta Black. And the name of this show is called I Felt Your Gaze Upon Me, I Knew You Were Watching. And behind us is the Memorial Portrait Series, a series of memorial images of people that have been lost to gun violence. And it's a project she started in 2016 that's ongoing. And we'll be doing a Facebook Live conversation with her on February 22nd to speak with her about her work as an artist and activist. I am so thrilled, first this show with T. Eliott, who's sitting here, whose exhibition on memory and the radical Black imagination is on view in our second gallery. And we'll have some images online so people can see them. And then afterwards, people are welcome to walk back through. We'll keep this reception open so that people can continue to drink and enjoy the art here. And the exhibition is a collaboration with Eliott Arts, and it's the second in an ongoing series with them. So we are very grateful to them. Part of the exhibition was to invite Niama Safia Sandy to write this really beautiful essay that's in our exhibition brochure. We'll have that available online as well, and are thrilled that Niama is here joining us today for this incredible talk. So I just want to read their bios and then let the two of you get started. T. Eliott Mansa was born in 1977 and lives and works in Miami. Mansa received a BFA from the University of Florida and an MFA from CUNY Hunter College in 2018. In 2020, Mansa presented For Those Gathered in the Wind, a solo exhibition at L&S Gallery in Miami, curated by Donna Marie Baptist. A catalog accompanied the exhibition. Additional exhibitions include David Castillo Gallery, Rush Gallery in Brooklyn, and Gallery Martis in Baltimore, Maryland. Mansa received the 2019 Ellie's Creator Award from Eliott Arts and was also a recipient of Green Space Initiative grant. Mansa has participated in studio residencies at ArtPace San Antonio and Eliott Arts. Niama Safia Sandy is a New York-based cultural anthropologist, curator, producer, and multidisciplinary artist. Her creative practice delves into the human story through the application and critical lenses of culture, healing, history, migration, music, race, and ritual. Niama Safia Sandy's aim is to leverage history, the visual, written, and performative arts, chiefly those of the global Black diaspora, to tell stories how we know in ways we have not yet thought to tell them, and to lift us all to a higher state of historical, ontological, and spiritual wholeness in the process. A text for the exhibition was written by Niama for this exhibition. So thank you both. Thrilled to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I wonder about the title. We've not talked about this, the title of this exhibition. So I'd ask you to start there.
Well, the title of the exhibition is borrowed from the title of my thesis exhibition. Well, not exhibition, but my
The
thesis
actual
paper.
written thesis, yeah.
So,
Which I actually read, by the way.
oh yeah. So yeah, it's just this link between memorializing and this idea that the way the work transformed objects from things that are meant to be sold, bought and sold, and transforming them into memorials and kind of that shifting of meaning that is a kind of prototype for this space of radicality in that this model of looking at the world and being able to dismantle and rebuild the world, so that this idea that I'm kind of questioning this idea of the artist as change maker, the artist as a political actor, but also kind of believing in the possibility of the audience, right? That if there's any possibility of a change happening, it's more likely that there will be something stirred in the viewer that would be able to act, not so much me as the artist. You know?
I want to come back to this word radical, right? It's interesting because I feel like when people use that word, it's usually attached to these like very grand, subversive ideas, right? But actually, if we talk about like math, right? Radical is actually like, it's rooted. It's like reducing something to its simplest form. It's the root.
Yeah.
And I wonder about what you think about that in connection to the work and this transformation of these objects.
Well, you know, when we talk about this breaking things down to the root of something, there's a radicality in that, especially as African people, in that we let's say in this nation, Black people believe in America. We believe in the American dream. We believe in picking ourselves up by our bootstraps. Every time we advance as a nation, it's because someone who was denied their rights made it possible, be that gay marriage, or be that women's suffrage, or civil rights, Fair Housing Act. Like these are acts by people who've been denied rights to expand the right for everyone, right? So when we talk about, you know, breaking things down to the root, how is it that you come from this place of taking someone who is making an attempt to be fully American, fully Protestant, and fully Western, yet breaking it to the root? So there's a radicality in tapping into something that is ancient and that presupposes the West, or presupposes these American ideals, you know. So just like, you know, small things like natural hair, right? It's radical to wear your own hair the way it grows out of your own head, you know. So to be oneself in a world that is built on your back, to be yourself is a radical act in itself. And to be born is to exist for purposes outside of your own choosing.
Well, all right. I mean, we had a whole conversation about sort of following the trajectory of the essay, but I think based on where we are right now, we maybe can't do that. So I want to actually talk about, just in keeping with this idea of that connection to this like continuum of African thinking, right? I want to talk about your use of materials and those connections to diasporic traditions. And there are multiple ones, right? So you have, of course, you know, this air quotes outside of our tradition of assemblage. And maybe we can talk about why I put that in air quotes in a second. But also, you know, you have many West African traditions that for me, like immediately looking at the work, for those of you who haven't had a chance to have a look at that work, it's how would you describe that process? See what I did there?
Well, I find that, well, prior to this, I was making collage, right? So
Even before that, what were you doing?
before the collage, I was making portraits,
Mm-hmm.
and the portraits definitely was a space where I felt that when you work with a certain type of representation, skill is really, it's very difficult to leave the conversation of skill, right? Where there is a pleasure in the kind of narcissism of seeing yourself in the work, right? So shifting into collage, there's this act of taking, cutting, readjusting, reconfiguring, right? So I think of this idea of sculptural processes of taking like a bark of this, or taking this plant, or taking this bone, taking things that have these meanings associated with, and recombining these sculptural acts, and that there being a medicine, or there being a work in combining elements, and that there's alchemy in combining, and that was something that really, it came out of this process of collage, but it also spoke to West African kind of, I almost don't even want to call it art making, but it is art making, right? But it is even more than it is making art. It is making things happen. It's making these are processes of protection.
Absolutely.
And
I was like, let me give you this space. I'm gonna jump in if I have to.
No, you good.
But I also I kind of want you to spell it out more in terms of the ways that you're approaching the making.
Mm-hmm.
So from pigment to material to in some cases there's a passage where I say something about the vasculature flourishes of the full plant life in the sculptures, right? I just kind of want you to give people a bit more insight into that.
Well, one thing I'll say about the flowers per se is that there was this moment where every week there was another hashtag, and after that hashtag, when I say hashtag, I mean this person, someone who died at the hands of the police. They would become a hashtag, become a trending topic, and then the city would burn down, right? And then this would happen by the next weekend. It would start all over, and this was back to back to back for a summer, or for who knows how long. So I was thinking about this idea of a mourning that is without end, right? So I thought about, when you go to a funeral and you place a flower, that flower is gonna die. That flower is only gonna live within a certain time frame. So I dealt with plastic flowers and different plastic objects to think about the perpetuity of this type of anti-Black violence, right? This is a foundational type of violence, and in the same way, I'm looking at these sculptures, because when you look at these sculptures, and I traveled to Benin, and these dudes would cut the goat's neck and pour this animal's blood onto this sculpture, right? Mm-hmm. Very different from going into the Smithsonian, where there's a pedestal and there's glass.
I'm sorry, wait, Ty.
Sorry.
It's true. You go and you see African art, and it's like it's behind a pedestal,
And it is decontextualized.
yeah, it's decontextualized, right? So seeing this kind of feeding of these sculptures, you know, I can't help but think about how the Black body has acted as like almost a sacrifice to the concepts of modernity and democracy and
Anything harder than what I'm kidding.
Always.
the development of capital in the West, right?
Certainly.
I was thinking about that perpetuity of mourning, but also thinking about that in my feeling of powerlessness and of mourning, of deep hurt and pain, I was looking for ways to, you know, I just felt that art was not enough, right? Art is a solitary pursuit. You're in your studio, you're making things alone, and I'm looking at the news, and people are taken to the streets. People are putting their bodies on the line to protest and to take these feelings, these same feelings I have, and to put them to use. You know, so I felt that. For me, you know, the same thing, you know, I was in school, right? So you're always looking at art, you're always searching for art. So my thing was, where is an art that does what I want to do, which is make an art that protects the community. So I looked at, you know, I traveled to Havana, traveled to Benin, and seeing these different art practices. So what would usually happen is that, like, let's say, we have like a compound, right? So if someone lives in here if someone lives behind that door, there usually is like a vigilant object that's placed outside the door. So that might be a legba at the door, that might be a boccio object, but these sculptures kind of exist beyond the threshold, and these objects are able to defend but also attack, right? And it's very interesting, like when you look at it, these are like the threats inherent in like the actual art making, you know? So like there might be like a nail through like the jaw, and that would speak to like,
I almost wish that we could have like had images that both of us chose of like those types of objects, just so that people could kind of have a better understanding of what we're talking about here.
yeah.
So in a lot of cases, for example, a lot of you may have seen, like if you've ever been to like a museum that collects these types of objects, they'll have the Congo Minkisi Konde, which is usually like the ones that have all of these nails driven through. So that's what he's talking about. And often like those are placed in specific areas to respond to specific things, which is what he's saying.
Right, you know, and it also kind of made me think about like, you know, we have these conversations of like, oh, pick one color and pick one material and communicate with that, you know, all these art school
kind of constraints.
Or like these ways to get you to speak through material, through the process of making.
And form.
And form, right? And you look at, you know, these objects, and you would see, like, let's say there's always like string. So string would act in binding a threat or binding an enemy.
Usually red.
Red, fire, spicy. There would be some kind of spice in it, or there would be like the object would be spit on, or tied between spit and speech. So all these elements, and it was just kind of interesting to see this similar kind of ways that objecthood communicates, that choices of materials communicate and speak and threat, and it's just kind of phenomenal. So in making these pieces, I take objects, and I always have to like preface this. I don't take objects from real memorials.
Right.
I always have to explain that I'm not like grave robbing, you know, because people really, when I say take, I don't mean I take. I reference.
Mm-hmm.
So these objects reference roadside memorials, right? So what I want to do is create an experience where you see these things and you remember something that reflects your experience, that reflects Hollywood, reflects Gould, reflects Opalaka. But aesthetically, I wanted these objects to feel very like Nkisi, right? I wanted them to feel aesthetically like these West African sculptures, but I didn't want to quote them because, you know, I just felt like it's almost, I don't know, like I think there's always there needs to be more space for the respect for African spirituality,
Absolutely.
right? Because you see like a choir in a chicken commercial. You know, it's like, yeah,
Like
you know, how you gonna switch Jesus for chicken? You know, so you know,
I feel like this requires just a slight pause. just for like a second. Just let that one sink in.
Nah, for real, like, there's not enough. You know, it's like you think of holiness, you think of like the Catholic chorale. You know, like the this beauty, but I think there has to be room for respect of African spirituality. So I felt like I needed a distance to not directly quote because these things do certain things. So when you start, you know, I remember I was looking at like Haitian Veve, and this dude was like, "Look, no, you don't redraw these things because the wrong day, the wrong time." You know, like the wrong day, the wrong time, you're gonna open yourself up to, you know, who knows what, right? So, you know, I always thought about that and like not wanting to directly quote and almost appropriate. We don't think we don't think of Black people of being appropriators, but there's room for that conversation. So I wanted the feeling. I didn't necessarily want to quote, but I wanted them to feel. I wanted them to be recognizable from one side and then to feel like something else.
Right. And I think you've done that, and I think that is actually a really generative space to sort of continue building a different aesthetic that has that resonance, right? So I think let's maybe talk about the ways that this is referencing those, you know, the many myriad contemporary issues. I think you fell asleep while we were talking about this. I think we passed the school that Trayvon Martin
Croft High School.
on our way here.
Yeah.
And you know, this is February, so this is now 10 years, right? And I think in a lot of ways, I always tell people this, right? People are always like, oh, there's so many more like murders of Black children and Black people by the police and these other types of extrajudicial killings. No, there's not. Only reason you think that is because you now have a cell phone that plugs you into things happening apart from where you live specifically, right? All of this has not ever stopped happening. Like this is just, we are now more aware of this because of the ways that our society is connected, right? So I think it's an interesting thing to think about the ways that technology has like allowed us to kind of like remove a veil in a certain manner of speaking, in seeing those things. But that said, I think obviously without this becoming a conversation about the extreme like pain of that, but just wanting to be able to do something and using your art to do so.
I mean, what do you do? You know, like you have to figure out what to do with the pain of it all, you know, and how to process, you know, the hurt, you know, and also recognize that, like, all right, so let's say there is a videotape, right? Let's say someone pulls out a camera and someone is murdered on film. Like, what do you do with the fact that that does not matter at all? That you seeing everything, how it went down, you knowing it was wrong, means nothing. You know, it's not gonna, it's not going to
change the carriage of justice in that situation.
No.
But didn't Derek Chauvin, wasn't he convicted because somebody videoed what he was doing?
But, you know, that is almost the point of the conviction, to be able to say that. To say, well, 1 out of 50, you know, and it's like, you know, it's easier to never lock anyone up again if you can say,
Here's this one.
Here's this one, right? And also, like, think about the brazenness of that killing. Like, think about how long 9 minutes and 43 seconds is. You know, this wasn't a shooting. It was, you just knelt on this man's neck for almost 10 minutes. You know. And all in the name that somehow that was a defensive act, right? So
For a bounce check, no less.
right. Well, that's always. I mean, when we start compiling like
Right.
the reasons, they're silly.
Right.
They're like
And that's putting it mildly.
you know, getting Skittles and Arizona iced tea, you know, playing music too loudly in a gas station, you know, to think that basically, you know, this goes back to the root of things, is that like it's a radical act to get to who you are, right? The thing is that like you have to say, if you're raising a black child, you have to realize that your child is not seen as the way you raise them. Your child is seen in the imagination of broader America, right? So the threat is not the child you raise. The threat is the lens through which your child is seen, because your child is amplified through 400 years of theorizing
Right.
about how hypersexual, hyperviolent, rapacious that black people are viewed as this projection
Of whiteness,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah,
If
I mean
we can,
that's like
speak plainly.
that. I mean, but that's like, I don't know if you need to do that, right? You can't. The situation is that there's no actual reason to do these things to anyone. But if you can create a reason that they deserve this to be done to them, then that relieves the burden
Absolutely.
of having to empathize with these people, right? So you have to live next to the person that you're enacting these emotions on, and you have to find ways to process the fact that your life depends on these type of acts.
Right.
So
And the maintenance of the space between you and whoever that other
right,
person is.
right. You know, and that's really a tricky thing to see that, for instance, like like Marcus Garvey, the Garveyites would say things like, oh, we need to make sure that our women aren't raped. And as much as black men were accused of rape, the idea that Black women would be protected from the white community's gaze or sexualization or rape, people really like lost their minds. That they couldn't get into the Black community to enact their lust. You know, it was almost like, okay, this is a bridge too far that you want to stop us from having access to Black women, you know. So it was always a thing where we were viewed as hypersexual, yet, you know, these people's wives weren't enough. You know, like that is this projection of like taking one, you know, looking at one's life and figuring out like how do we live with this. And this also happens in Africa, right? Like how do societies live with the selling, with the kidnapping, with the shipping of you know, hundreds of thousands of slaves. So we see some of these acts, some of these sculptures as like this psychological protection against these slave raids, you know. So yeah, you look at these sculptures and you see them bound, you know, and it's almost like a miniature threat that you can be bound and shipped away, you know. So that there's a similar thing of like, how do we process the fact that there is this level of I don't even know if there's a word for the violence, you know. So how do you live knowing that there are these ports here that are shipping people off, right? You know, because you look at Ouida in Benin, you know, it's a city associated with like witches and
Vodun, right?
Yeah, and Vodun. Yet, you know, this is like a key slave port, you know, so it almost exists as like this Mecca, you know, but it also was a center of great violence, you know. So we see the need to process grief, you know, process how you live with these things, you know.
But I mean, such is the nature of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't stay mired in grief forever. Which I think, in some ways, you know, and I say this, I think at the very end, if I may.
Yeah.
The works in their wholeness are a catalyst toward a reinvigorated Black imagination. Together, abstracted, patinated, they practically warble and alter call. So, in case you can't see this on your own, so that's alter, both ALTAR and alter ALTER. I like to do that in my work. It's weird, but I like it, and it's functional. So, the rich and graceful darkness singing out for us to resist the most corrosive and violent elements of our society toward becoming our highest and most connected and resplendent selves. In a moment where it seems the racial fissures of the last decade have surged forward with a vengeance, and the supposed equity gains of summer of 2020 have all but vanished, anything that feels like it might actualize, fortify, and steady our collective resolve is necessary and welcome. So, I mean, something has to give, right? Because there has to be, I think about this in my own work, this idea of joy as a portal, right? Because like, you know, all of these things have to exist because that's life. That's the way that being, having a human experience works.
Yeah.
You have to contend with all of these elements all at the same time. You don't get to choose. Actually, you do. You get to choose how you respond, right? But you don't necessarily get to choose how it all happens, right?
Well, I think, you know, when you mentioned ecstasy, you know, and I think that's where African traditional, that is our space, because that's really all that we have is the singing and the dancing and like the Holy Ghost, like that is what we have at the end of the day, like ecstasy, going beyond the physical and
So let me do something real quick. So what about this idea? I forgot who I was talking to. This came up this week, and I kind of was like, oh. Maybe I was listening to a talk. I don't remember. And I'm sorry if whoever said this to me is watching. I'm really sorry if I'm like not remembering. Getting older, I'm almost 40, it's a thing. So there was this conversation that I had this week where someone said, the Trinity, right? Oh, I know what it was. I have like a subscription to Heal House, which is this space in New York that does like meditations, yada, 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 right? And so this particular meditation on Sunday went off the rails in a way that I was not expecting. And somehow the person who was leading the meditation started talking about the Holy Trinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And no disrespect to anyone who feels very strongly about this, but I thought it was provocative and interesting, so here I am sharing it. And so this idea that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost is actually like the divine feminine. And the teeth, so to speak, have been taken away from women in this way, right? And so then thinking about that womb space, right? Because essentially that's like where everything happens.
Right.
And I mean, we all have womb space, and going again back to the Mikisi Konde, specifically, which you're talking about the feeding of those sculptures. Like if you ever look, a lot of them have like this empty belly space, right? And the reason for that is because that's where the medicine goes.
Right.
And there has to be, and it's interesting, I actually wrote an article I keep remembering, 2021 happened, so that was not last year. 2020, there was a show at the Baltimore Museum of Art called Mother Power. And so they were looking specifically at these like Mikisi Konde and all of these other West African sculptures, and the fact that all of them had these womb spaces, even if they were not, like some of them had penises as well, right? Sorry, children. I don't know how much you know yet, but and so that mother power thing is not a thing that's limited to gender, right? And so that then is this like really fruitful, no pun intended, idea about like what we can all be thinking about and how we can all be like creating. Am I making sense here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of are, I think there's like, you know, like when we watch, like, what's that show, American Horror Story or something? And they've got like all these people and these practitioners, you know. So like,
Are you talking about the specific one in New Orleans?
Yeah. You know? So this idea of like, you know, these people, but it never looks like the usher, you know, the deaconess, you know, like the black women, you know, Baptist, holiness, Pentecostal women, you know, as like the kind of matrons of these hoodoo traditions, you know what I mean? So you kind of have to look at this space where African spirituality exists, but also it rests in the middle of Christianity, right?
This syncretized space.
Yes, these syncretized spaces. And I'm really, like, my next body of work really is going to cut, because we think of, like, you know, we think of the Nation of Islam and how, like, the Nation of Islam was, like, this hodgepodge of, like, created beliefs, right? Where they were like, oh, we need something we need something, so we're gonna create this thing.
But all of that even was what? In an effort to protect Black people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But that's something, when you look at a nation, you could be like, oh, this is absurd, right? You could look and be like, you can judge, because it's like, why are there UFOs in the middle of it? You know what I mean? Like, whereas we don't look at our own ways that we create Christianity too. You know, we create things for our needs,
Right.
right?
It is a human drive.
Yeah, we create, you know, the things that we believe create us, we create them. You know, so going back to the need for transcendence, you know, that we find these spaces of ecstasy and pleasure, and even the blues is like the iconic space of going in,
Right.
you know, going out through going in.
And so this is, before you,
No.
literally right before you said that, my internal thought was, even as much as all of that feels external, it is very much internal,
Mhm.
right? It requires, you know, so I have an ongoing, I don't know what it is now, but right now it sort of lives as a sound piece. But I wrote like most of the sound or the spoken parts of it.
Mhm.
And one of the things is like, there is no innovation if you can't keep your head cool, right?
Mhm.
So this idea of coolness, you know, through Robert Farris Thompson and many other scholars,
Mhm.
this coolness, like you don't get to those evocative, ecstatic things if you don't go there first,
Mhm.
right? And that's a kind of like internal peace that you have to reach.
Yeah. Yeah, because you can't, we're not made, so usually there's this thing, right, where, or even in like Pentecostal situations where someone catches the Holy Ghost and the deaconesses kind of have to attend,
Hedge,
yeah, they have to attend to you and like,
I mean, that exists in a lot of different, like, Black spiritual contexts.
yeah, because usually that you have to cool ahead because you can't take the divine can't fit in your brain.
Right.
So you have to be taken and tended to and brought into a space where the divinity can rest on you, but not destroy your sanity.
Right.
So you have to be tuned to a frequency where you and the divine can exist.
In the same vessel.
You know, so there's always this rushing off and calm and cool and brought back where that person can like prophesy and speak, you know. But yeah, it's interesting, this idea of cooling the head down. And that being like, you know, it's an aesthetic, you know, the cool is an aesthetic and it's,
I mean, but it's not just an aesthetic, right?
Mhm.
Like, it is a generative space
mhm,
in the culture across the diaspora.
mhm.
And I don't know that, like, we acknowledge that as much as we maybe should.
I mean, I don't know, like I look at so much of the richness in these communities, and Black culture isn't a place where, you know, like there's no pedestal.
Sure.
There's no, I mean, now we got, you know, we have a Smithsonian,
Mm-hmm.
so there technically is
Mm-hmm.
a space for this, right? But you look at these things that are studied, and they exist kind of within the mundane. They exist within the vernacular. They exist in everyday run-of-the-mill thing, you know. So there's no, these things are hidden and exist, but they're not like lifted up and placed as high art, you know. Even the vernacular,
I mean, I
the
think
sculpture.
that's changing.
Yeah.
I would say that's changing, especially as you in the context of contemporary Black art in the moment, a lot of that is referencing, like directly referencing, you know, a lot of ATR and other like spiritual traditions.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because you have like what I try to make sense of is why Port-au-Prince and Havana and Benin and Alabama and G's been like why is there this overlap in the aesthetic? You know, why are these people taking used objects and repurposing them? I don't know.
It's
I don't
not
have
even
an
just
answer.
that too,
Yeah.
it's also like the use of geometric forms in this very specific way as well. And I mean, this is the thing, you can only make what you can make, right? In the context of like, it's there, it's been there for hundreds of years, and possibly longer than that, depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
So, the question becomes, what is, and actually, in a lot of ways, for me as a curator, this is what I'm thinking about, and like where is the bridge across the gap?
I don't know. I mean, I just think, I don't know. Like, I don't know if there's one answer.
Sure.
For
Or where are the bridges? Plural.
I don't know. I mean, I think memory, that's why we go back to memory, you know, because memory isn't just what you remember, you know, and that's an important key. Like, you remember what you don't remember too, you know.
That's why I said you can only make what you can make.
Yeah, you can only make what you can make, you know, so there's a space for all of this memory, for all of this things, you know, because there's no conversation. That's the tricky part about it. Like, there's no, I mean, there was with the shipping, there was communication, but right now, even with the internet, people aren't having conversations from like Cuba to Haiti to Jamaica. You know, like, no one taught people how to make the same thing. And,
all of
you know
these
what I
different
mean?
concepts.
All these different,
Sure.
different concepts.
I mean,
right?
somebody did, right?
Yeah.
But like 500 years ago,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's this longer continuum of culture.
Yeah, and I look at let's say Kehinde Wiley, right? And you know, I love him, but this is the thing that confuses me, and how Kehinde Wiley elevates a Black figure by placing it within a European context, and that way Europe is the thing that makes the person special. Whereas I look at
I'm gonna not respond. So you go ahead.
because I'm on the internet, so I'm also applying for his residence.
That's gonna go super well. I can see it now. Keep going.
But you know, I look at there's so many art practices that aren't necessarily, even sometimes aren't considered art, right? So I try to figure out where there's room to acknowledge the Afro-Atlantic as a place where art history
Absolutely
exists, right? So that I don't have to say, like, you know, there is even the flowers. The flowers tie into like the Vanitas paintings, right? Where there is this Western tradition of creating space for our making room for making sense of death. Right. This exists in Western art. So there is space where this work speaks to the Western art canon.
Yes.
But I also think that there's room to
reference yourself.
Yeah, there's room to reference yourself and to realize that the more you look into it, the more you look, like, you can't look at Alabama and not look at the Congo, because you're looking at the Congo. You're already looking at the Congo, right? And the more you look at it, the more you see these things meeting from the corners, that they're meeting in the middle. So that space, I think that's where you find something interesting, not to justify like, oh, this matters because of the African things that carry over. It's not some, that isn't the magic. The magic is
that it continues.
Yeah, these people survive. The fact that these people live, that these practices are going on right now, and they're not just going on within these people who have inherited this. They're happening like everything that is in that space bleeds into, like you can go to Sherman Williams and get Haint Blue. You know what I mean? Like these things are crossing into wider American culture. You know.
I mean, are crossing?
No. Yeah.
I'm gonna interject real quick because we're going into about 5:30 now.
Okay.
And I wanna make sure that people have a chance to have a drink and we can keep talking.
Right? Yeah.
I haven't seen the work yet. Are you
I
gonna close up
did
the
bring out, so I do have this one memory jug that T. Eliott made that I love. There's two things that I do wanna mention. Was that these are really beautiful studies that you made, that you think of them as these kind of sketches that you make. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit about that. And my own other personal question is, we talk about grief. And I would love to comment on not just like how do you deal with the sorrow or sadness, but also the idea of grief as something like, well, it's something universal. It does encourage empathy. It does encourage understanding. And then, but there's also like that beauty, because there's so much beauty in the works that you make. Like they are these memorials that are just very, very beautiful ways. Like, do you think of them as like specific things that are meant for like a certain person, or is it a more general idea? Like, because that's one of the things that I picked up is this very beautiful, like isolated gem that makes me think of like, this is one person, this is one idea. So,
I mean,
you can tell me I'm wrong.
no. I mean, they aren't necessarily like for individual people, but they are like individual spaces, if that makes sense. Like I'm trying to make this one, like it's almost like braiding things into one space where I can like braid things together like here, so each individual object is like a space where things happen and where things are acknowledged. But I don't know, like I don't know if I give myself permission to name things after like an individual, you know what I mean?
It gets to be, names matter, right?
Yeah.
So,
And they definitely matter, and yeah, your pieces have very different titles, different series that you were saying.
I think we find ourselves in an interesting place right now, especially like, the hashtag thing, like people's names are constantly being spoken in ways that aren't necessarily in memoriam, so to speak. And I think like there's some danger in that, actually.
It's interesting.
I mean, like when we look at I wonder like if I name a person, am I naming them for their political notoriety, or am I naming them for the family that's left behind? Like does this person belong to me as someone with my own agenda and my own political
Precisely.
take, or is this like a person whose family, like you put somebody on a t-shirt, you put them on what do you call it, like the protest sign, for lack of a better word. You know, you put them on a t-shirt, you put them on a hat, and, you know, someone has to constantly be
There's no rest
reminded.
in
Yeah,
that.
there's no rest in it, you know. So I'm uncertain upon like whether or not the aim is to specify or link the object to a person, because, you know, I don't know if I'm that person to be the one that makes a shrine for an individual that I don't necessarily know. You know, my thing is to recognize that there are countless unnamed, and that's where the word speaks to, like, pull up like the unnamed, to acknowledge the unacknowledged, you know.